There was one mysterious death, and even history's greatest sailors feared it. When sea trade and naval conquest were at their peak, it is said to have killed more sailors than war and storms combined. And in the 18th century, it nearly wiped out an entire British fleet on a mission to circumnavigate the globe. A death so powerful it could have crippled the British Navy itself, but the government ignored it.
So what was the silent killer, and how could something as ordinary as a lemon have saved the British Navy purely by chance?
Britain was at war with Spain over the control of the Caribbean. The conflict was known as the War of Jenkins' Year, named after a British sea captain whose ear was cut off by Spanish coast guards during a search of a ship in 1731. An incident the British government later used to rally public outrage and declare war. It was during this war that the British successfully captured Puerto Bello, a port situated on the northern coast of the Isthmus of Panama. This victory gave them the power and confidence to plan a much larger attack that would cripple Spanish trade across the Americas. And that was when a 43-year-old British captain was given the responsibility of a very important expedition. His name was George Anson. The plan was to launch an assault on Spain's most important possessions in the Caribbean, disrupt trade through the Central and South America, and finally, the most daring and vital job of all was to capture the Spanish treasure galleon Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, which at the time was carrying treasure worth the equivalent of around £60 million today. To achieve these, Anson would have to do something extraordinary: circumnavigate the globe, defeating every ship that would come his way.
You see, for such a feat, Anson would need the largest ships and the strongest crew.
So he was given 8 ships, 6 of which were warships led by his flagship Centurion, a 60-gun vessel with a crew capacity of 400. And the remaining 2 were merchant supply ships, Anna and Industry, which carried cargo.
Now for the crew, Anson needed 2,000 sailors to fight, sail and survive whatever challenges the expedition threw at them. But the Admiralty at the time was ignorant and frugal that it never bothered to supply any mission with the right tools and personnel.
The result of which he was supplied with men who were called invalids. They were soldiers who were too sick, wounded or old for active duty, but might be able to perform lighter duties. And in Anson's crew, they were all around 60 years of age. These men made up about 500 of his total force. At that time, there was this very unusual way of recruiting, or should I say forcing people into the Navy, undertaken by a group called the Press Gang. These naval squads roamed ports and coastal towns, seizing men by force or deceit, sometimes storming through taverns or dragging victims straight off the streets. Through press gangs, Anson received 170 sailors, and around 200 more were Marines, who were much like trainees who had no license to fire, given that they knew how to in the first place. And so in September 1740, after a 6-month preparation with about 1,854 men, George Anson and his 8 ships set sail.
Now this is the route that Anson and his crew would take.
They set off from Spithead, England, heading south to Madeira to restock supplies. From there, they'd sail down to the Brazilian coast. This is where they'd feel their real climate shift, moving into the tropics. Then attempt what would be the hardest crossing of their entire journey, rounding Cape Horn. This region would be where they would face their most disastrous loss. Not because of the weather, but from the mysterious death that all previous sea travelers feared. After that, they'd make their way up the Pacific coast, weaken the Spanish ports and plunder the treasure galleon in Philippines. And then finally sail home to England, rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The ships were now more than 3 months into the expedition. They had restocked and were near the Brazilian coast.
Life at sea was never close to comfortable, and let's call every condition that weakened the sailor as weakening agents. And we'll know why this is important as we move through the story.
Now every man on board was driven by relentless manual labor day and night. When storms tore through the sails or snapped a mast, repairs had to be done immediately no matter the hour. So sleep became a rare luxury for most of the voyage. And being at sea meant that the ship was always wet and damp. This resulted in the clothes staying soaked for weeks and salt hardened the fabric.
This wasn't new for sailors. Indeed, they faced it on every expedition they went. But the difference this time was that Anson's crew hadn't started out strong.
These ships always carried a wide range of food, consisting of fruits and vegetables, but they were always limited since preserving them for long duration of travel would be impossible. Hence, the best choice that sailors had was to carry dehydrated items. This consisted of a large quantity of dry, salted meat and hard biscuits, which was often described as being eaten by worms and rats and reduced to dust. And finally, huge quantities of rum and water that tasted more like swamp than a drink. All these weakening agents made them easy prey for sickness.
If only a few men fell ill, they could be isolated and treated. since every large ship had a surgeon on board. But these ships were built for war and not for comfort.
Every inch of space was utilized to store gunpowder, cannons, and muskets, leaving only the barest fraction for the men themselves. They hung hammocks so close that there was just enough space to turn sideways.
Once a disease reached a sailor, it would spread like fire, sweeping through the entire crew.
Given such dangerous conditions on board, cleanliness and hygiene were enforced with harsh penalties, though never so harsh as to cost a sailor his life, because every sailor on board was too valuable to lose. The crew had their first experience with disaster. To clean their ships infested with flies and rodents, they had their 4 ships docked, because 3 ships were lost and 1 merchant ship turned back home. They were now at St. Catherine's, a place that might be normal for local sailors but not for the British. This was a tropical territory, a climate they had no immunity to. And you've guessed right, most of them were struck down by the dreaded disease malaria. It left sailors even weaker with relentless vomiting, pounding headaches, and high fever. It even claimed the life of the trial's captain, who suffered from the most severe form of the disease called cerebral malaria. That's when the parasite Plasmodium invades the brain, triggering a severe neurological damage, followed by seizures and then death. The crew had to fight malaria with just the meager food they had, since there was no cure on board. Another setback caused by the ignorance of the Admiralty. For the next 30 days, it kept taking lives as they traveled, until the colder climate of Patagonia finally brought the outbreak to an end.
In March 1741, just 2 months after battling malaria, the crew sailed on, only to face what would become the worst sailing disaster in Anson's voyage.
A passage so feared that sailors who survived it often wore a badge of honor or tattoo to prove it. So why was this place so dangerous? Cape Horn sits in a zone dominated by one of the 3 major wind circulation belts in the southern hemisphere, called the Westerl Ice. To pass into the Pacific, ships had to navigate the narrow stretch between Cape Horn and Antarctica, known as Drake's Passage. Here, there is no landmass to break the wind, hence strong winds race around the planet uninterrupted, building incredible speeds. As the Earth spins, the Coriolis effect bends these westerly winds slightly to the left in a counterclockwise direction. These winds, driven by the planet's rotation and fed by the Antarctic circumpolar current, result in some of the highest average wind speeds on Earth. These collide with powerful shifting currents to create steep, chaotic waves, often reaching up to 98 feet in height. This was so disastrous that Anson's flagship chaplain, Richard Walter, described the nightmare in one of his journals.
And the storms were just half the story. Alongside the cold, hunger, and exhaustion, they faced what every sailor feared: the mysterious death.
The death toll rose so quickly that at times 5 men died in a single day. Richard Walter recorded the symptoms in a harrowing detail. Sailors bled from their gums, teeth loosened and fell without warning. Their skin broke out in small reddish spots across the palms, feet, and torso. The whites of the eyes turned a deep yellow and their joints stiffened, locking as if they refused to move. And bones that were once broken would fracture from the slightest touch. Some men lay shivering and the others had silent depression. And the dead were tied up in the hammocks they slept in and then thrown into the sea. As the scurvy spread, more men died and the ship's crew could not even clear the corpses fast enough. Rats would feed on the ice and flesh of the dead before they could be even thrown overboard. And this was exactly what sailors had endured for centuries, from Vasco da Gama to Francis Drake.
So what exactly was happening to them? Here's a nylon rope. Our body has a tissue similar to this. It is called collagen. And collagen is a type of connective tissue. Now, connective tissues act as superglue and as structural frameworks that hold everything together in place.
Now, if you pull apart these nylon ropes, you see the individual strands. In the same way, each collagen chain in your body is like one of these strands. And each one is twisted together with 2 others to form a triple helix structure called the tropocollagen.
But if collagen were to stop right there, it wouldn't be strong enough.
So the body takes many of these nylon ropes and binds them together side by side to make collagen fibers, the tough finished product that gives tissue their resilience.
So here's the key part. The step where the chains are twisted and where the chains are attached together as fibers require a special cofactor. And that cofactor is actually a vitamin, and that is vitamin C,
without which both the steps would fail. The result is a weak, unstable connective tissue, and that's why in scurvy, sailors bled from their gums, skin split, and bones broke. Their body superglue and structural framework was literally falling apart.
The reason that this appeared only on long-distance journeys came down to just one thing: the food they carried with them.
When ships left port, they were always stocked with fresh vegetables and fruits. But as the journey went on, those were the first to disappear. The only thing that was left were meat, biscuits, and rum.
Now, it's not that vitamin C is completely absent from all these food.
Take a look at this table. It shows the amount of vitamin C per 100 grams for each source. On average, an adult needs around 70 to 90 milligram of vitamin C every day, but that's for normal adults. These sailors, on the other hand, were under intense labor and constant stress. This meant that they need higher levels of vitamin C. Because vitamin C is not just for building collagen, but it's also used for producing hormones like adrenaline. And in sailors, adrenaline was always surging. Even if they had cabbages or fruits at the start of the voyage, the supply would be gone in less than 2 months. And it takes only 1 to 3 months of eating food with little to no vitamin C to develop scurvy. 1 month at sea, 2 months to reach the Brazilian coast, additional sickness with malaria, and a total of 6 months before rounding Cape Horn. By this time, the crew had been deficient for a few months. And when they finally left Cape Horn, out of the 1,200 men on the 4 surviving ships, only 335 were still alive. And Anson knew they couldn't go on like this. They needed shelter, fresh supplies, and time to recover. And that's what led them to the remote island of Juan Fernandez. Tents were erected rapidly to treat the bleeding men, and everyone was craving for the vitamin-rich produce around the island, preferring it over meat.
This is an interesting subconscious survival adaptation seen in many organisms, including us humans. It is called specific appetite or nutrient-specific hunger. When the body senses a deficiency in any sort of nutrients, it sends signals up to your
hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus, brain regions that have already learned without you knowing that a certain food A once relieved or provided the body with nutrient B. This is the same reason certain foods help relieve stress like chocolates. You have them whenever you're stressed, and from then on, if the body is stressed, it seeks out chocolates.
While that is a conscious learning, nutrient-driven behavior is subconscious.
It has been observed in people with low salt who crave salt-rich foods, in dialysis patients with low calcium who seek out more cheese, and more strangely in patients with zinc deficiency who eat sand, a condition called pica. The same way the sailors searched indistinctively for food with more vitamin C. The crew remained on Juan Fernandez for the next 3 months, slowly regaining their strength. And once fit for duty, they attacked the Spanish trade along South American coast. They seized the ship off coast and burned the town of Paita in Peru. And the next mission was to capture the treasure galleon. Anson and his crew stayed in Acapulco waiting for the galleon. But the galleon stayed in harbor, never leaving. And this forced them to start their Pacific crossing.
Almost a year had passed with their first encounter with scurvy. First, so does that mean there's a second? Well, here's the thing. Blind science is always dangerous. The same mistake, not knowing why certain things happen, often led to the same things happening again. And in their case, it was scurvy again.
It killed 5 men a day, cutting the crew down even further. And that meant that they had to find the nearest island fast if they wanted to survive this expedition. If not, everyone would end up in the sea. That brought them to Tinian, a northern Mariana island where they would stay until everyone recovered. The incident was so devastating that it was immortalized on historical plate engraved with a tree that bore the fruit Anson said have saved all their lives. The crew recovered and set out to complete the expedition once and for all. On June 20, 1743, Anson and his crew, a total of just 131, reached the treasure galleon off coast in Manila. After a long and brutal fight, they captured it. And the greatest irony was that only 4 of Anson's men died in the battle, compared to the 1,500 plus lost to storms and scurvy. With the prize secured, the surviving crew of the Gloucester were transferred to the Centurion, and Gloucester was set on fire. The Centurion now carried not just the treasure, but also the few men who had survived the deadliest voyage in British naval history. With the treasure, they turned for home. June 1744. By way of the Cape of Good Hope, the treasure was brought back to England and taken straight to the Tower of London. Anson was hailed as a hero, and in 1751 he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. But for Anson, it wasn't much of a celebration. He never forgot the faces of the men he had lost. Out of 8 ships and 2,000 men, only 1 ship and just 188 men completed the circumnavigation.
This disaster stands out as the best documented tragedy caused by scurvy in naval history.
But what stands out most isn't the gruesome images of the disease, nor the slow recoveries. It's the sheer ignorance of the government. They never bothered to investigate the cause of death, nor to work on a solution that could protect the next men sent to sea. The Admiralty, obsessed with the next conquest and expansion, pushed aside the deaths of over 1,500 men.
And because of the neglect, more lives would continue to be taken by scurvy in all the next expeditions.
20th May 1747, the day that would bring an answer very close to solving scurvy, but blind signs, like always, made chaos. James Lind, a British naval surgeon on board the HMS Salisbury during the War of the Austrian Succession, took matters into his own hands when he saw his crew affected by scurvy. He already knew about scurvy, having read reports of multiple cases, especially Anson's devastating journey. That incident affected him so much that his publication, A Treatise of the Scurvy, was dedicated to Anson.
When Lind saw his men affected with scurvy, unlike others who speculated on multiple theories, he came up with an experiment
now said to be the first account of a clinical trial. Here's what he did. Out of 12 men with scurvy, he divided them into 6 groups of 2. They all received the same diet, but in addition, Group 1 was given a quart of cider daily, Group 2, 25 drops of elixir of vitriol, which is sulfuric acid, Group 3, 6 spoonfuls of vinegar, Group 4, half pint of sea water, Group 5, 2 oranges and 1 lemon, and Group 6, a spicy paste plus a drink of barley water.
By day 6, the treatment of Group 5 was stopped because they ran out of fruits and vegetables. But the results worked so well that Group 5 recovered enough to act as nurses for the other groups.
At the end of the trial, Lynn noted that oranges and lemons had the best result, followed by cider and then sulfuric acid, where the others were practically useless.
Here's why all of this was just out of pure luck, and the reason why the results of this experiment was ignored for the next 42 years.
Lynn thought of scurvy as a putrefaction disease, where the body begins to rot from the inside out. Given the clinical pictures of scurvy and the lack of scientific understanding, scurvy might look like the body is rotting. And this theory of Lind made him believe that anything that rots can be slowed down by giving acids. That is the reason why he chose the acids and not the fact that those might contain anti-scurvy substances. He was lucky that among the sources that he chose was the cure to scurvy, which was lemon and oranges. The scientific fact is that it was not the citric acid inside them, but rather vitamin C. Now Lind was so confused with his own study that he went on to say, "Since it is a putrefaction disease, I believe a mixture of acids could be much beneficial. And as for lemons, he said, they seem to work better. But given their cost and the difficulty of storing them on long journey, it would be wise to use Rob, which is boiled lemon juice."
So did it work? Absolutely not. In fact, the results weren't even close to the beneficial effects of fresh lemon juice.
Boiling lemon juice destroys much of its vitamin C. Had Lynn known vitamin C was the key, he would have never suggested it. A thoughtful, neat experiment that came so close to giving the answer once and for all was ignored by the Admiralty again for the next 42 years. In 1794, 2 Scottish naval physicians, Gilbert Blaine and Thomas Trotter, who had expanded on the works of James Lind, were convinced that lemons were indeed the closest thing to a cure for scurvy.
They also added that, along with lemon juice, fresh vegetables must be added on board in appropriate quantities based on the duration of voyage.
And with the command and persistence of Admiral Alan Gardner, it was finally approved. The first ship to test this was the HMS Suffolk on a 23-week non-stop voyage to India. Each crew member received 2/3 of an ounce of lemon juice mixed into grog, which contained around 10 milligrams of vitamin C. And for the first time in British naval history, not a single life was lost to scurvy on a voyage of that length. This was a turning point. The demand rose so quickly that more and more ships adopted the same. The British had finally accepted the closest possible solution.
Humans, unlike other animals, cannot synthesize vitamin C. And that is the reason why we need to take vitamin C in our diet.
In 1907, 2 Norwegian physicians, Theodor Froelich and Axel Haas, made another incidental discovery, another stroke of luck. They were studying dietary changes in guinea pigs, and guess what? Guinea pigs, just like humans, need vitamin C in their diet. And it was during that study did they discover the exact signs and symptoms that sailors faced at sea. The guinea pigs that were fed on just grains, which had extremely low levels of vitamin C, when replaced on cabbage and lemon juice, was cured of the signs and symptoms.
Scurvy, for the first time, was replicated in a lab. but this was just a proof that it was a nutritional deficiency disease.
The entire problem would be finally solved once and for all by Albert Diordi, a Hungarian biochemist in 1930. He had successfully isolated a special molecule which he named God knows, since he did not know the actual structure. And he had to rename it to hexuronic acid after a publisher would not allow him to use that name. And later in 1932, it was indeed the same molecule that was present in the lemon juice extract purified by British scientist Walter Haworth at King's Lab. And this was the final answer to scurvy. It was vitamin C.
Today, scurvy still exists in places with food scarcity and poverty, but the deaths have come to a low level. Yet, every life lost today due to scurvy is an injustice.
Because this is a disease that can be prevented easily with nothing more than vitamin C rich foods. In a world racing ahead with technology and science, allowing anyone to die from a nutritional deficiency says something uncomfortable about our priorities. How we choose to reflect on that is up to us. The story of scurvy leaves us with an important question.
When science stumbles across an answer that could save multiple lives, should we use it immediately based on experimental proof, or should we wait until the theory is fully understood, tested, and accepted, no matter how many lives are lost in the meantime?